Hey, what's going on, guys? So, I've had quite a bit on my plate recently, some personal stuff, also trying to get this modern JavaScript course done. So, I've been looking to have some guests on, and today we're going to have on a fairly new YouTuber. He has a small channel. His channel's name is Cooper Codes, and he's going to build a React and Stripe shopping cart application with you guys. So if you enjoy this content, if you enjoy the project, check out his channel. I'll have the link in the description. And the idea is to give some of these smaller channels some exposure, and at the same time, give you guys a cool project to do while I'm working on some stuff. So hopefully you enjoy it, and I'll let Cooper take it away from here.
Hey there, it's Cooper Codes. I just want to start by thanking Brad for having me on the channel. I actually used Brad's videos when I was just starting to learn how to code, so I'm super excited to be your instructor for this project. I'm going to get started by showing off the finalized version of the project. We have 3 different items here. We can add them to our cart. We can have different amounts in the cart. For example, I can have 1 sunglasses, a bunch of different cameras. You can also remove these items from your cart. As you'll see here, we have a cart in the top right, just like you'd expect, and it will show all the totals for all the different products in our cart. This project is interesting because when we actually purchase these items, we're going to be sent to a Stripe checkout. In the Stripe checkout, you'll see we have the same products in the same quantity that we had in our cart. So I filled in some test credit card data here. My name isn't actually Cooper Codes, and so I can pay by pressing the button here. And we will get a little thank you for your purchase from our store. If we go over to our Stripe dashboard, which don't worry about, we're going to get into this in more detail later in the video, we can see that we have a successful payment that got processed. The payment has an invoice that shows the same items with the same quantity and the same price as we saw in our React frontend. Yeah, so this is a great, really full React project. We're going to be working with React Router, React Bootstrap, a basic Express backend, and also using the Stripe API. Let's get into creating the front-end components for our React application. Let's get started by going to an empty folder and opening up a terminal, and we can create our React application by saying npx create-react-app, and then the name of the folder we want the React app to live in. I'm going to say store. We can now see that we have our empty React application with everything we'd expect. We can go into the store folder by saying cd store. Now that we're inside the folder for our React application, we can start by installing a couple packages we're going to need for the front end. So we can say npm install. We're going to need Bootstrap for the Bootstrap styling, and then React-Bootstrap for the pre-made React Bootstrap components. And then we're going to need React-Router-DOM for the React routing, which helps us go from like page to page, for example. We can npm start just to make sure everything is working well on the React side of things. We can see that we have a boilerplate React application, which is perfect, exactly what we want. We can get started by creating all the different components we need for our front end. The first component that we're going to work on is the Navbar, which is going to be that little bar you see at the top of a web page. For these components, we can go into our source folder and make a new folder called components. This is where all of our different React components are going to live, and I'm going to create a component called navbar.js. We can initialize a functional component by saying function, the name of the component, which I'm going to say navbar component, and that's the full definition there. If we want to export this component so other files can take a look at it or use it, we want to export default navbar component. When designing our navbar, we're going to use a couple of different external components from the React Bootstrap library. We can import everything we need by saying import from React-Bootstrap. The components that we need are going to be the button. This is going to be for when we want to click on our cart, for example. That's going to be a button. We're going to need a container for our navbar to live inside. We're also just going to need the navbar from React Bootstrap, which gives us a bunch of preset styling. It's super easy to use. And we're also going to need the modal. The modal element is when you click on the cart and it shows that screen on top of your web page, showing you all the different data related to your cart. So let's get started by building out the return statement of this navbar component. We're going to want to initialize a navbar here, and we're going to set the expand property to the navbar of small. This determines where your navbar collapses for like mobile screens and stuff like that. Small looks good on this website, so I'm going to choose that. We can start by setting that navbar.brand. That's that big title you see to the left, and it's going to point to a link of just slash, which is going to be like the home link for our webpage. And we can make that little title or brand say e-commerce store. We're then going to have a navbar.toggle. This navbar.toggle allows us to have that little element where if you're on a mobile screen, some of the stuff is going to collapse. And so we can tell the navbar what we want to collapse by using this navbar.collapse element. We want the items within the collapse element to be to the very right of the bar. So we can say class name is equal to justify-content-end. And so you can think of it as like the start of the row is kind of at the start to the left. Then the end of the row is at the end, which is going to be to the right on your web page. We're then going to have a button, which is where the user is going to click on the cart. For now, we're just going to say cart with 0 items. Later in the video, we're going to set up that whole cart system and then eventually change this to show the active amount of items in the cart. So let's bring this navbar into our app.js. We can run over to the app.js file here and then import navbar component. So we can get rid of the boilerplate React application code here and just put in the navbar component. And before we start the application here, we're going to want to make sure to import the Bootstrap CSS. So we have to do this manually by saying bootstrap/dist/css/bootstrap.min.css. This import is necessary because it has these style sheets that we need for our Bootstrap components. So let's npm start our project and see what it looks like right now. So as you guys see, our navbar is kind of very far to the sides. We can bring in a container from React Bootstrap. This container will allow our entire application to kind of sit closer to the middle of the screen, and so we can wrap our entire application. So now that the navbar is inside of the container, if we go back to our localhost, it's going to be more centered, which is pretty good. So now that we have a basic idea of the navbar figured out, we can get into showing different pages to the user by using React Router. React Router allows us to show the user different data based off the link they have. For example, if we do localhost 3000, we want to point that to some type of home component, for example. If we wanted to do localhost 3000/success, we would want to show some type of success component. So this is what React Router helps us do. We're going to import 3 essential things from React Router. So we can import the browser router, which is the overarching router. Then we can have routes and route from React Router DOM. In every single page of our application, we're always going to have the navbar at the top. So we can choose where to put the kind of special data by making a browser router. Within the browser router, we're going to define the routes tag. Inside of the routes tag, we can have all the different routes, so like I have commented at line 8 and 9. We can have a route with the index property. This allows us to have a route show for the kind of base route or just the regular slash you might have seen before. And we can point it to a certain element. For now, I'm just going to write in some components that we haven't created yet, which we're going to create after we make these basic routes. We have a store route, which is going to be at the base route. So if you go to localhost 3000, for example, it's going to go to the store. And if we want to point to a specific route, we can say path is equal to success. This means if we go to localhost 3000/success, we're going to show whatever components under this element. So for example, the success component, which again is something we are going to create. We're also going to have a cancel path. So I just copy that line over and I'm going to change the path to cancel and the element to cancel. React Router best practice is to call these elements not components, but instead pages. So we can go over to our source folder, make a new folder here, and create a pages folder. Inside of pages, I'm going to make 3 different files. I'm going to make a store.js, which is going to be for the actual e-commerce store. The cancel.js, which is the page for if Stripe payment gets canceled or the user exits out of the Stripe payment. And then also the success.js, which will send the user to if they have a successful payment. So let's start by going into cancel.js and making a very basic cancel component. So it's just going to be a function named cancel. I'm going to export default cancel at the bottom. And for this component, I'm just going to return a very simple little h1 that's going to say, sorry to see you canceled your Stripe payment. I'm going to copy this entire component here, which is very simple, but I'm just doing this to show you guys the routing initially, then we'll get into building the more full pages. So over at the store page, for example, this is going to become a huge page eventually, but we're just going to change this function to store and export default store. And I'm just going to have an h1 that says, welcome to the store. Same thing, we can copy this component, go over to success, and then under here, instead of saying store, we can say success, success. We can say thank you for your purchase. So if we run back over to our app.js, store is undefined, success is undefined, cancel is undefined. So to define these components, what we can do is we can import cancel from ./pages/cancel. That's going to get the cancel component, and we're going to do a similar little import for all the other pages as well. For example, we're going to get the store from the store page, and then the success from the success page. If we go to the base root, so just localhost / like up here, we're going to be sent to the store component. If we go to the success path, we're going to be sent to the success component, and same thing for the cancel path will be sent over to the cancel component here. So let's npm start our application to see that routing work. Amazing. So at the base root of localhost 3000, we are being shown the store component. If we go to /cancel, we can then see, sorry to see you canceled your Stripe payment. And if we go to /success, it's going to say thank you for your purchase. Just to clear something up is the reason why we don't have success or cancel under like the Navbar, for example, where you can click on them and go to them, is because Stripe is going to redirect our users to the success path or the cancel path based on how they interact with the Stripe stuff, which I will explain in way more detail when we cover the Stripe stuff. So let's go over to our store component and make some basic cards for our actual products to live inside. So we can go to the store page by going to store.js under pages, and now we have our store. We are going to use rows and columns to show all the different products on our website. So I'm going to start by importing row and column from React Bootstrap. I'm going to put this whole store in a little React fragment. This just makes it so the JSX code doesn't get mad at us when we have two elements next to each other, and it wraps everything together for our store. Because under the H1, we're just going to start by creating our row. On an extra small screen, we only want to show one column for the rows, but on a medium screen, we want to show 3 different columns. So that's what these properties are doing here. I'm also going to give a class name of G4 to make everything look nicer. And within the rows, we can now use columns. For example, we can say column, and I'm going to use the align equals center property just to make everything look nice. And in here, I'm just going to make a very simple H1 that says product. And I'm going to copy this over just to show you guys. In a second, we're actually going to make a product card component, but I just want to show you guys how these columns and rows are working first. So let's go over to our localhost. Amazing. So you guys will see, although they aren't pretty looking cards, we have products in our store, which we can eventually turn into components. And just to give an example, this row is really amazing because it can handle as many columns as you want. For example, we have 5 products here. And so that's an interesting thing about this project is it's super expandable. You can have as many different products as you want. You can change the data around. But one thing that let's get into right now is how do we dynamically load products? Like I have sunglasses, a camera, coffee. How do we know where to load those from? To make our lives easier, I'm going to go into the source folder and make a JavaScript file called products.store.js. I'm making this a JavaScript file because I want all of our different components to have access to the product information on our web page. So we can make an array of the products by saying const products array is equal to an array here, and we can make objects to represent the data for each product. For example, every single product is going to have an ID, a name, for example, coffee, and then a price, which I'm going to make a double and make it $4.99, for example. And so we can make 3 different products because I think that's a good amount for not going super overkill because I know it's kind of annoying to write this stuff out. We can have the second product have an ID of 2. And I'm going to make that sunglasses, which I'm going to make, let's say $9.99. And then the ID of 3 here, and I'm going to make this last one a camera. And I'm going to make this expensive. I'm going to say $39.99 for the camera. And so we can actually export this products array at the bottom, and this allows us to and you need curly braces around this because we're actually going to export another thing as well. Spoiler alert. But this allows us to give this array of data to any component inside of our JavaScript project or inside of our React project. All we need to do is say import productstore.js and grab the products array from it. A function that's going to be helpful for us to get the data of a product from only the ID is going to be function get product data from a certain item's ID. This is nice because let's say we only have the ID of a product in our shopping cart, for example, but we want to know the title and the price of a certain product. We can make a helper function so we can say, okay, get product ID with a certain ID here. It goes into this array and gets us the data we need from a certain ID. And so we can use the array.find method here. And so we can say let product data equal to products array, which is an array which we just defined right here, dot find. What dot find is going to do is it's going to allow us to loop through every single element. So the current element it's looping through is called the product, and then we can use an arrow here to represent what do we want to do with this product. Well, we want to see if the product.id, so for example, it's looping at this ID, this ID, this ID, we want to see if that is equal to the ID that was passed in from our parameters right here. And you'll see Visual Studio just lit up because now we're using the ID parameter here. So if this ID was the string 3, for example, you could say over here 3, and eventually it's going to say, okay, first product, this is an ID of 1, that's not 3. ID of 2, that's not 3. ID of 3, that is 3. And so it's going to return this full object is what product data is going to be. And so let's change this 3 back to ID. And so if it finds no product, let's say we pass in an ID of 4, it would have no product. And so then that's going to return undefined. And so if the product data is equal to undefined, we can just do a little console.log to help us, is we can say product data does not exist for ID. Then we can just add the ID to the end of the string there. And we can just return undefined here. I'm not going to handle this case in this video actually, but this is just in case, you want to make sure you cover all the different cases you can. And at the bottom here, we are going to return product data. For any intermediate programmers or people more familiar with this, I already know what you're saying, but I think this is worth explaining, is product data, if it's undefined, we're just going to return undefined anyways at the bottom here. The reason why I'm adding this extra return statement at line 25 is because I think it makes it way more easier to read. It's if we have this product data equals undefined, we want to do certain logic as a result of that. I think just to explain for the furtherment of people's learning is that we could get rid of that line at 25 that was just there, and it would have the exact same code because if it's undefined, it'll log this and then return here. I kind of just prefer this extra return statement because it kind of makes the logic more easy to read, where it's like, if it's undefined, we do these things. We don't want to be like, oh, we console log and then fall into doing the next thing. It seems kind of odd to me. So that's why I keep the return undefined here. And so we can also export functions alongside the regular products array here. So we can export this get product data like this. And this is going to allow us to be able to call this function anywhere else in our React application. So if we go over to our store, we can have a good example of importing the products array. So we can go to store, and at the top, we can say import products array from .. products store. And so this gives us access to the actual products array. If we want to build columns based off of a certain array of data, remember it's looking something like this, an array where it's an object, and then another object, and then another object. Obviously, I'll do some dots to show that there's actually data inside those objects, but when we want to go over this array, we can use something called a map. And so let's delete all these different columns except for just one, because now we can create columns based off the actual products inside the products array. We can do that by saying products array.map. So map allows us to go through every single element in the array and then do certain logic based off the element we are at. And most importantly, return actual React JSX for a certain element. So we can define the product and the index here. So if we're mapping over a certain product, let's say 3 different products, we can get the current product wrap with this product variable right here. Then we can define our logic by doing an arrow here, and I'm just going to do some regular circle braces like this. The parentheses here mean that it's expecting us to return a JSX element immediately. So that means we can create an element of code for every single product in our products array because we're mapping over it. It's also important to notice that we can actually use this product object that we're currently on. So if you go to our product store and you look at every single object here, you'll see that we have a title, for example. We can access this by saying product, which is this whole object here, and then title, which is this property here. So let's go over here and we can do curly braces and say product.title. We are also going to use the index of where we currently are at to make unique keys for our columns. This is just best practice for React. So let's go over to our application and see what it looks like. Amazing. So we have access to the coffee, sunglasses, and camera, which means that we also have access to the whole object of data there, which is really neat. To make it look a little nicer, we can align this header on the top to the center. And then also give it a class name that's going to give it some padding. So I'm going to say P3. Let's go see what that looks like. There we go. Way better. And now we can get started on creating an actual separate component for all the logic of our current product to live in. Because we don't want to make our whole components right here, for example. So we can go into the components folder and make a product card.js. We can define the product card by saying function product card like this, and then export default product card. And for this example, we're actually going to have the props of the element that we're going to use as well. And so we are going to pass in the actual product through props.product. So I'm just going to keep this comment just to make it helpful for you guys. Props.product is a product we're selling, and it gives us access to all the different information of that certain product. In order to make a nice looking card for our product, we're going to need to import a couple of things from React Bootstrap. We're going to import the card, the button, the form, row, and column from React-Bootstrap. So let's get started with styling the card by returning here. We can start with the large overarching card. So everything is going to be living within this card. Then we are going to have a card.body, which also, again, everything's going to be living within. So these are the two overarching ones. We can start with card.title, which is going to give us a nicely styled title for our card to use. And we can actually get access to this props.product by saying const product is equal to props.product. And so if we want to get the title of the product, we can look at the product store, see how these objects are structured. And like you can see, it's going to be product.title. So we can say product.title right here. We can then do a card.text, and we can similarly access other properties such as product.price. And I'm from the US, so I'm going to put a $sign in the beginning here. Also because we're going to be using USD for the Stripe stuff, but you feel free to use whatever currency you want. Then at the bottom here, I'm going to make a very simple button. It's going to have a variant of primary. Primary in Bootstrap is just that nice like Bootstrap blue color, which you guys will probably recognize. And for now, it's just going to say add to cart, which of course we don't have the functionality for that quite yet. But now we have the full product card. So we can actually bring this product card over to our store page. So we can import the product card like this from component/product card. For anyone unfamiliar with properties, I'll show you how that stuff goes down right now. We can create a product card component like this, but this is an example of a product card with no properties on it. If we want to pass in properties, we can say that the product property is equal to product like this. You might be like, product equals product. What's happening here? This product is defining the property, and then this product right here is looking at the product we are mapping over, is what's happening there. And so we're able to access this product equals variable by, if we go back over to our product card, we can say props.product. Props is going to be a list of all the different properties on our component, and that product is going to be that object. That's also why we're able to say const product equal to props.product and then get different properties from that object, for example. So now that we have an actual product card being rendered, let's go look at our local host. So this is a basic start to the front end. You'll see these add to cart buttons. They don't do anything. This cart 0 items also doesn't do anything yet, but don't worry, we are on our way. So let's go over to our Navbar code and get started on creating that modal that pops up when we press the cart button here. And the modal is that little screen that makes everything behind it a little bit darker, and it will show you all the different items inside the cart. So here I am in the navbar component. I'm going to separate the navbar and the modal by creating a React fragment around this code. So we're going to have the navbar be the first component inside this React fragment. So now we can define our modal. Modal has an incredibly important show property, which means is the modal being showed or not. And we're going to set it equal to a show variable that I'm going to create in a second. So I'm going to use the onHide property. So whenever the hide event happens, we can go call a certain function. I'm going to make a function in a second called handle close. And when we click on the cart, this little cart button here, we actually want it to show the modal. So on here, we can say onClick is equal to handle show. To store the show variable, I'm going to use the useState from React. And so we can import useState from React. useState just allows us to have local variables, and don't mind these errors, we're about to fix them up in a second. And we can define the show variable by saying show, which is the variable, and then the setter to the variable, which is going to be set show. And I want to initially have that modal not showing. You could imagine it'd be weird to load up a site and then the cart's like in your face right away. So it's going to be false initially. And we can make some nice, simple one-liner functions by using some arrow syntax. So we can make the const handle close is equal to an arrow function where we set the show value to false. So if that close event happens or that on hide event happens, we hide the modal. Then we can copy this code and we can then handle the show. So if we wanted to show the modal, we can set that show variable to true. And so before we go and test out this functionality, let's go and make a couple more things here. For example, we're going to need a modal.header, and I'm going to give it the close button property, which just means it's going to have a little button to show the user they can close the cart. Then within the header, I'm going to have a modal.title, which is just going to say shopping cart. Then there's going to be a modal.body, which is where the majority of our code is going to live. For now, I'm just going to have an H1 say, this is the modal body. Pretty simple for now because we're going to delete it later. But now let's go back to our website and refresh it and see if we can access this modal. Amazing. So you guys will see we can click on the cart and it's going to show that little shopping cart modal. This is the modal body. We can also close it by pressing this button here, which is very nice. That's the nice thing about this on hide event that we can listen to is that's going to get called no matter if we press on the outside or if we press on this X here too. So it's kind of nice in that way. As you guys see, we don't have any actual shopping cart logic in our React website quite yet. So what we're going to do is we are going to go and create a cart context by using create context from React. Context is amazing because it allows us to store the cart data. So for example, the IDs and like the quantities of what items you have in your cart. And it also allows us to store functions that we can call anywhere in our entire application. For example, if I wanted to add an item to the cart, we could call a function from our context. You don't have to fully understand that, but I'm going to get into that right now and show you guys what I'm talking about. So we can go over to the source folder here, and I'm going to get started by creating a cart context.js. Context is particularly nice when you need data or functions that are necessary throughout a bunch of different parts of your application. So we can get started by making a context by importing create context. And I'm also going to need use state eventually, so I'm going to grab that while we are here. And I'm also going to get access to the products array. And so let's get started by creating our context. We can say const cart context is equal to a create context like this. Contexts kind of have a flow where you have the actual context. So you can imagine your cart, add to cart, remove cart, add. It's just, this is more like pseudocode, but just example like that. Then you're going to have something called a provider. The provider gives your React app access to all the things in your context. So you can imagine if we wanted add to cart at a certain, component, boom, we got it right here. If we wanted to remove the cart or whatever that means, we could have it right here. That's just an example of what this context is. And we initialize that by creating an object in this create context here. For example, if we wanted the items to the cart, I'm going to hold those inside of an array. Variables are probably the easiest one to understand for context. If I want access to the cart, I can get that anywhere I want. But add to cart is a little bit different. So if we want to add functions to our context, it's going to look a little bit different. If I wanted a get product quantity function, for example, I'm going to set it equal to an empty arrow function, which is going to have no logic. You might be like, why do we have this weird function with no logic? Because I'm about to do this like 6 times. So here's why I'm explaining this, just so you guys know, is because we don't define the functions right inside of the context. All the context is saying is that we can define a function for get product quantity. We're going to have code down here, which is going to help us create the full code for get product quantity. And then when we actually have a function for get product quantity, we can then pass that to our provider. Hopefully that makes sense. The context is just saying a function should be here. When we actually pass values to our provider, which of course I'm going to show you guys, that is what's important. Those values to the provider, we can actually pass the functions in then. This context is just saying we have room for a function to exist here. It's probably the easiest way to think about it. So if we want to add an item to the cart, I'm going to call it add one to cart. And again, just an empty function with no logic. And we can just copy this line over and over. I'm going to remove one from cart. I'm going to delete from cart. And so that's going to be helpful for if we just want to boom all at once, delete all the items from the cart as opposed to one at a time. Then I'm also going to get the total cost of the cart. This is going to be a helper function that's going to help us for when we want to see the total at the end. And so to give our application access to this context, we can say export cart context here. We can now get started by working on the cart provider that I'm talking about. Export function cart provider. Then we're going to get access to all the children of this element. I would say don't be too concerned about what this children property means. It just means that if we were to wrap CartProvider like this, for example, anything inside of here is going to be the children. And so if we wanted to wrap around it our entire application, for example, we'd want to make sure our entire application goes on the inside of this, if that makes sense. So inside of our provider, at the very bottom, just to show you guys where we're leading to first, we're going to have a very simple return cart context.provider value is equal to context value, which I'm going to define in a second. And then we're going to pass in the children, is why that weird children variable is necessary. And so we can even define the value to our context. I don't know if it's going to throw errors, but let's see. Items is going to be equal to a state eventually. I want to see what it does for get product quantity. Is it going to be an error? Not yet. Okay. So we can actually have all these different properties here. And I'm just going to copy it like this and then just delete like this. Saves us some time. Because what we're doing here is we are going to define all these different functions. So we can get started doing that. And we also want to define items. So we can make a state that is specific to our provider. And we can do this by saying const, I'm just going to say cart products, set cart products is equal to a use state with an empty array. And so we can actually set this items here equal to this state. You might be like, okay, this is kind of confusing. Why do we have an empty array of cart products? Well, what's going to happen is when we create these functions, we are going to use this cart product state to manipulate what our provider is giving to the rest of our application. You can imagine add one to cart is a great example. I have this provider and it's showing information to my whole application. If I add one to cart, I can go to this array, add an item to it, and then this value that's being tossed to the rest of our application is going to have that new added item to it because it's referencing this cart product state. So here's the fun part of this video is this is actually really great JavaScript practice for anyone who's not familiar with JavaScript or hasn't really worked with it much. So seriously, I would say from coding this myself, really great practice for making all these different functions. And just to explain one final thing before we get into making all these functions, in our cart, we are going to store the ID, let's say is 1, and then the quantity of how many of those items we have in our cart. That's all the information we're putting in our cart just to make things as simple as possible so we don't have a bunch of other data kind of swimming around in there, right? And so I'm going to leave this comment here just to show you guys this is the data that we're working with. And a cart with, let's say it has 2 ID1 items, a cart would actually look like this. So our cart products array would look like this, for example. So if we wanted to figure out the quantity of, let's say, a certain ID, we can make the function here where we can say function get product quantity, have it be a certain ID, and we can say, okay, CartProducts.find. And this is why I say it's such a great JavaScript practice because we're going to use a lot of these array functions. And so .find gives us access to the current element that we're looping over. So for example, the current product. And we can see if the product.id is equal to the ID that we passed into this function. And so I'm going to show you guys a cool a mistake on purpose to, further your learning is we can say .quantity. So if we find the product with a certain ID, we want to get its quantity. But imagine, what if this were to happen? Undefined.quantity. That's going to be an error because you can't get the property quantity out of undefined. It's going to toss like a red error, not like a joking around error. And so if we want to safeguard from that, what we can do is we can add a question mark right before the dot. This means that if this .find gets us an undefined object, pretty much meaning there is no product with that certain ID, for example, we are not going to ask for the quantity. But if this .find becomes an actual object of data, for example, if it's ID of 1, it's going to give us this object, then we're going to get the quantity property. It's kind of some cool syntax because it allows us to grab this quantity here. And if quantity is undefined, we can then return 0, which is nice because, we don't want to return undefined, for example. Otherwise, we know that quantity is going to be that actual number, for example, 2 in this case, and we can return quantity at the bottom here. So just to run through this code for an example, let's say we have the ID of 1, and goodness, that's my bad, that was commented wrong, but let's say we have the ID of 1 here, and I pass in 1. What's going to happen is we're going to go through cart products, which let's imagine is this array, and we're going to find the product where the product ID is equal to the ID we passed in. So if 1 is equal to 1, it's going to give us this full object, and from that full object right here, we're going to grab the quantity out of it. The quantity is then going to be 2, as we have right here, 2 isn't undefined, so it's going to pass this, and then go and return 2. So that's the explanation of that function. And guys, if you're new to JavaScript, I would say don't get discouraged. This is kind of some more intense code, which is kind of why the video is longer. And so really don't be discouraged if this is kind of hard to understand, just really try our best. All right, so that's all I really have to say for get product quantity. We can now get started by creating the logic for add one to cart. So we can say function add one to cart. Then we can pass in the ID. So from the front end, we can be at, the ID 1, for example, and we're going to say, hey, I want to add one of these to the cart. So initially, we're going to ask for the quantity of the certain product. And this is why this code is so cool, is because we can say const quantity is equal to get product quantity of the ID. Why do we need this line so much? Well, because we need to see if there's 0 elements or if there's 1 element. Take a look at line 17 real quick. If I wanted to add one more item to the ID of 1 here, I would have to go in here and say, okay, go to the quantity of 2 and then add 1 to it, which makes it 3. But if I had a product with an ID of 2, what would we have to do? Oh, we would have to add another object here and say ID is 2, set the quantity of that equal to 1. So this is just an example of what logic we need to do, is we can say if it already exists, for example, if the, let's say the quantity is equal to 0, because that's kind of the case that we return here, then we know we have no objects there. And so that's going to be our two different things, is product is not in cart, and then the else statement is product is in cart. And so now we can actually set our state. So we haven't used the setter for our state yet. If the quantity is 0, what we can do is we can set cart products equal to an array of elements, and we can use the spread operator on ... cart products. So that's just saying take all of the objects that are already in our cart and put them to the front of this array. Then on top of all the objects that are already in our cart, we want to add another one, which is going to have an ID of the ID we passed in here, because that's the item we're adding to the cart, and it's going to have an initial quantity of 1. And so if the product is in the cart, we are then going to use set cart products again. Inside of here, we can then say CartProducts.map. I'm going to show you guys this map one thing at a time. What we're doing is we are going to go through every single object inside of CartProducts. Let me bring this array down for an example here. If I wanted to add to the product ID of 2, for example, I would go map over this object and I would say, okay, is this object of the product ID 2? No, it's product ID 1. So I'm just going to keep this object here. Then I'm going to go to ID of 2 and I'm going to say, okay, instead of giving the quantity of 1 again, I want to add to my CartProducts.map the quantity of 1 plus 1. And so we can write that logic out by saying, okay, take the product we're currently mapping over. And if the product.id is equal to the ID we're passing in, we can then use something called a ternary operator, which I can say question mark, which means if that's true, if the product we're currently on is of a certain ID, then we want to change that object and add a different property to it, is kind of a way to think about it. Instead, return, and this is kind of confusing syntax, so bear with me, ... product, which is saying all the different properties of product, put them in here. So if product is an object and you say ... to the object, it's going to use the spread operator to give you the ID of 1 and the quantity of 3. And then we want to overwrite the quantity. So we can say quantity is equal to product.quantity, because remember, with the map operator, we have access to the current product we're at through this product variable. So if we were at this first one, it would be this object, for example. And so that's how we're able to access the quantity. But if we look at our example here, we wanted to add 1 to that quantity. So we can say plus 1. And so that's the logic for adding on this new object with an extra 1 on top of the already existing quantity. So you can imagine if the current product's quantity was 3, then you would have 3 plus 1. It would give you 4 instead in your cart. We can then use a colon, which is the kind of the else statement. And so you can imagine this like if statement is true, and then over here is going to be if statement is false, and then down here is going to be the if condition. That's kind of how you should think about this .map code. And so else, what do we want to do? We just want to add the product back to our array like normal. So we can just use the regular product object. And so just for learning's sake, you can fast forward if you guys already get this, but just for anyone who might be a little bit lost, let's run through this code. we're mapping over cart products, which let's say is this array, and we want to add to the ID of 2. We can start mapping and start with our first product. Okay, which is this product right here. Does this product ID equal 2? No, it's 1, 1 doesn't equal 2. And so it's going to enter the else statement. And this map is slowly building up an array that looks like this. And so at this point, we just have this. Now our map is going to access the second product. And we're going to say, is the product ID equal to the ID of 2? Well, it is. We want to add the product ID of 2, and this is the 2 product. So instead, what we're going to do is we are going to take this entire product, which is pretty much what the spread operator is saying, and instead show the quantity where we take the current product quantity and add 1 to it. So our code is literally doing this. Take the entire product and then add 1 to the quantity. So, aka, it's going to become 2 on the quantity here. I know these maps can kind of be interesting and weird, and this is like, I would argue, advanced JavaScript because we're using a map and then we're also using a ternary statement. So if you're confused about the question mark and the colon, that's called a ternary statement, but you can kind of see the logic right here. And so before I do remove 1 from cart, I'm actually going to do delete from cart. So we can say function delete from cart, and we're going to take a certain ID. So delete from cart is just going to totally wipe out whatever amount of products from our cart of a certain ID, of course. So if we had like 20 sunglasses, it would take all 20 of them out of our cart in one function call. So we can start by setting our cart products state. We can get the current value of our state by saying cart products and then using an arrow. We are then going to use this value of cart products and we're going to filter over it. Filter pretty much does this. It starts with an empty array, and if an object meets a condition, then it's going to add the object to array. That's the most basic way of thinking about what filter does. So I'm going to put this comment up here actually. So if I had, product 1, product 2, product 3. And I wanted to remove product with an let's just say this is an ID of 2, for example. What I could do is I could pass in a filter and I could say, okay, as long as the product doesn't have an ID of 2, pass it over. Okay, is product 1 an ID of 2? Nope, it's not, which is good. Pass it over to the new array. So product 1 here is product 2. Well, that does have an ID of 2, so we don't want that thing anymore. Then product 3 is not 2. So boom, that's kind of the basic way to think about how filter is working. And so we can take the current product we're at by saying current product, use an arrow, and then we're going to define some logic for, okay, what is the actual condition here? The actual condition is going to return the current product.id doesn't equal ID. And so if this is true, the current product is good to go. It's going to get passed to our new array. If it's false, for example, 2 doesn't equal 2, that's false, right? And so if it's false, it's not going to add it to our new array. And so that's a cool way to use filter to build a pretty simple delete from cart. And so let's go back to above delete from cart, and we can make that function remove 1 from cart, which is going to take an ID. And so we can again get the quantity of a certain item by saying const quantity is equal to get product quantity of ID. If the quantity is currently equal to 1, we are then going to delete the product fully from our cart by saying delete from cart of the certain ID. This is because if we only have 1 left and we take 1 away, what's our quantity going to be? It's going to be 0, right? So in the else statement, we are then going to define a set cart products. So we're changing that cart state once again, and we can map over the cart products. Here's the thing though, check this out. I don't even have to explain the logic again, because instead of adding 1 to the quantity, we are going to remove 1 from the quantity. So scroll up to your add 1 to cart and grab this set cart products near the bottom of that function. We can paste it in here, and the same exact logic applies, but instead we're going to say product.quantity minus 1. And so that's pretty much the full logic for remove 1 from cart, is we're saying, okay, instead of adding 1, we're going to remove 1. And so the same logic as to how I explained above applies here, but it's pretty much going to loop through an array like this, for example. And when it sees that item's quantity, for example, if it saw the 3 here and we wanted to delete one of the IDs of 1, we would just say minus 1 and give us that new 2 value, for example. I'll also mention we don't really have a case here to handle quantity of 0, so feel free to add that if you want. But in our front end, we're only going to be able to access remove 1 from cart if we have a button showing that we already have something in our cart pretty much. So that's why I don't have that case here if you're curious about that. Okay, now we have to get the total cost of our cart, which is a cool kind of fun function because it requires us to get some external data. So we can say function get total cost. And we don't even need a parameter because this is going to get the total cost of all the different items in our cart. So we need every single item. I'm going to start by initializing a variable by using let and initializing a total cost equal to 0. And so if we want to get the cost of a certain item, we actually need to get the data of a certain item. So we can go up to the top and go to our product store. We can also say get product data here. This is a great example of when we can use this function to not have to rewrite the same logic over and over. So first, let's start by mapping over our cart products array. So I'm going to call it a cart item, and then we're going to point an arrow function to the logic that we want to use for this map. I'm going to use a const product data is equal to get product data of the cart item dot ID. Because remember, inside of our cart, we only have access to the IDs. So if we want the product data, for example, the title and the price is going to be the most important one here. We can then add to our total cost by saying total cost plus equals the product data dot price times the cart item dot quantity. And so this product data object gives us access to the price here, and we can see how many of a certain price do we have in our cart by looking at the quantity here. If we were to have 3 different items that were worth $10, it would say 3 times 10 is going to give us 30 and would add 30 to our total cost. And so we can return the total cost at the bottom here. All right, so if you made it this far, you are now officially a JavaScript array master, and congratulations. We can go to the bottom here and say export default CartProvider. And just to explain this kind of finally is we have this context value and all of these functions are now a different color because they are being defined as such above. And then these functions we can access throughout our application because we're passing them into this value. In order for our app to access this context, we need to take this cart provider and wrap it around our whole application. So let's go to app.js and then let's import cart provider from cart context. We can then go around our entire app and take this provider element and then wrap it around the entire container. So now anywhere inside of here is going to have access to the cart context. Let's go over to our localhost and make sure everything still looks like it should. I'm going to start by working on the product cards and making this add to cart button actually add to our cart. So in order to actually use the context, which is going to be that cart value, it's going to be all those different functions we just defined, we need to do 2 things. We need to import the cart context from cart context, and we also need to import use context, which is a hook provided to us from React. And so if we want to access the almost cart object, you could imagine, we can say const cart is equal to use context of the cart context. And so if we do cart dot, you can see we have access to all the different things here, all the different properties of our context, which are being defined over in our cart context at the very top right here. So check this out. We can actually use our context for once. We can say const product quantity is equal to cart.getProductQuantity. And we can pass in the product.id. Because if we go over to our cart context, we can go and check out get product quantity, and it's going to have the ID here. So this is going to allow us to see if we have an item that is in our cart or not. And we can also change this add to cart button to add something to our cart by saying on click. So when this button gets clicked, we're then going to call a function called cart.add one to cart. Boom, with the product.id. And so this is pretty cool. Check this out. I'm going to console.log cart.items. It's going to be a bunch of different logs, which is totally fine for now, but we can go and see that products are actually getting added to our cart in the front end. So as you'll see, it's logging that array a bunch of times, and boom, I can add these 2 things now, and check this out. I now have a coffee, ID of 1, has a quantity of 1, and then sunglasses, which I click on, ID of 2, quantity of 1, check that out. So if I want to add like a bunch of different coffees, for example, I now have a coffee with a quantity of 5. One issue though is we want to be able to adjust the items values in our cart, for example. So whenever we see that we have coffee has at least one thing in our cart, we're actually going to show a different thing on this component. It's going to have that remove button, and it's going to have like those plus and minus buttons as well. And so we can make that logic by going in here and saying a little ternary statement where you say product quantity. If it is greater than 0, for example, then we can show a different piece of code. And I'm just going to make it an empty element for now. Then we can do a colon for the else statement. And I can go in here and take this button and add it right there. So if the quantity is equal to 0, it's going to show add to cart. But if it is at least one item, then we want to show a different interface here. So I'm going to go in here and create a pretty basic form, and I'm going to do something called as row, which gives us access to some row styling inside the form, which is nice. I'm going to do a form.label. Its column property is going to be set to true, so it's treated as a column in the row, which don't worry if you don't understand this stuff fully. And it's going to take up 6 columns inside of the row. And I'm going to make it say in cart, then I can say the product quantity right there. So we can even use these variables to show kind of like interactive data to our user. And because this form is being shown as a row, I'm going to go in here and make a column that's going to take up 6 different slots in Bootstrap. I'm then going to make 2 different buttons. They're going to be a SM6 here, and I'm going to make a class name of MX2. This is just going to give some margin across them. One of the buttons is going to say plus, and the other button is going to say minus. So let's go and see what this looks like in our React application. Amazing. So right now we can add to cart, and then we are stuck here forever, which is pretty funny. These plus and minus buttons don't work, so let's go get working on that. We can change these buttons to on clicks, and so whenever the button gets clicked, we can run certain code. For example, if we hit the plus button, we're going to want to run the cart.add one to cart, and it's going to take a product.id. And then for the minus button, we can say, I actually want to remove one from cart, which is that other function we made inside of our cart. And while we're here, we can make this large button that kind of goes on the bottom of our card. I'm going to say button variant is equal to danger. That's going to give us that red coloring from Bootstrap. And I'm going to give it a class name of margin y, my-2. It's going to give us some margin in the y-axis. It's going to say remove from cart. And when we click this dangerous button on the bottom here, I'm going to say onClick is equal to calling the function, and I'm going to go to cart.delete from cart. And so that is that function that's going to totally erase the item from our cart, which we can say product.id right here. And so this is why making that context is so helpful, is once we have these context functions, we can really do whatever we want with our React application. And all we need to do is just call the function whenever we need it. So let's go back to our front end and see what this looks like. All right, so we can add to cart, we can add items, we can remove items, and this console log is crazy. I'll remove it in a second. And we can also fully remove from the cart like this. Add to cart, remove from cart, add to cart, add a bunch of sunglasses, remove them all, add a camera. There you go. And so now we have full functionality where we can add whatever items we want to the cart.items inside of our cart context. One thing that I'm going to go work on now is look at this cart in the top right. It just says cart 0 items. That's not very cool. It's not even showing how many items we currently have in our cart. So let's go over to our navbar and add the code that's going to use our cart context in the navbar. So I'm going to go over to the navbar, and just like I said before, we're going to use that generic setup where we import the cart context from our .. cart context. Then we also import use context as well. Oh, and we already imported from React above, so we can actually just add this use context to that. And to access that cart context, we could say const cart is equal to use context of the cart context. We actually didn't make a function inside of our cart context to get the amount of the total items inside of our context. But this is actually a really cool way of looking at it, is if you ever need extra functionality for looping through your items, let's say it's a one-off thing you don't really use often, so you don't want to exactly make a whole function for it and add it to your context, you can still do something like this. Let's make a const products count, and we can set it equal to cart.items. We can loop through the cart items and get the total amounts of all the different products quantities from our cart. I'm going to use .reduce. And so this video is really showing off all of the different array functionality you can make. I think we might have hit every single one. It's wild. But for reduce, we can have 2 different things, the sum and then the product. We can then do an arrow function to define the sum and the product. So whenever we go through an item inside of our list, we are going to reduce and go to that product, and we're going to add to a kind of counting up sum that's running every single time. So we can say sum plus product dot quantity. And then we also want this counter to start at 0. So what this reduce is going to do is it's going to give us access to all the different products dot quantities. So what this reduce is doing is it's kind of summing up all the different product.quantities, and then this entire statement here is going to return a number. And we can access that number through products count. So let's go over to our cart 0 items here, and we can actually put in some curly braces and add in products count. Do some parentheses around this like this, just for styling. So now our navbar is going to actively refresh and show the latest up-to-date products count value. So if we had 5 items in our cart, for example, it's going to show 5 items. Let's go back to our front end and see this. As we add items to our cart, it is showing the amount of items total. So I have 3 coffees, 1 sunglasses, and 1 camera. It's showing cart with 5 items at the top right here, which is super cool. This is a perfect example as to how we can use the values from our cart context in order to create functionality throughout a bunch of different React components. So now let's get started on the shopping cart and have it say something that isn't "this is the modal body." So we can use the cart data to show actual cart items here. So let's get started on that. So in our modal.body, we can make some functionality to show different things if we actually have items to show to the user. So if products count is greater than 0, we might want to show something else. If products count is, nothing, then we can show to the user a little header that says there are no items in your cart. Otherwise, I'm going to create a little React fragment here. And so this is where our actual cart data is going to live. And so I'm going to make a paragraph to start, and I'm going to say items in your cart, and we can list the items below. As we've done many times in this video, we can get some practice with the cart.items.map. We can take the current product, then also the index here, and then use parentheses at the end here to return an element right away. For now, I'm just going to do a simple h1, and it's going to show the current product dot title. And so before we look at that, I'm also going to do an h1 on the bottom that's going to show our total in the cart. So we can say total is equal to, and here's a really good example of how we can use curly braces. And even within curly braces, we can call that cart.getTotalCost. And an easy way in JavaScript to round values is we can do dot toFixed of 2. This is going to round our values so it only has 2 values after the decimal, because JavaScript has problems with super long repeating numbers, for example. And we don't even do any payment validation on our end because we just send all the information to Stripe. Then at the bottom here, we can have a button, which is going to be green. So I'm going to make it a variant of success to show that successful green. And this button is going to say purchase items. So kind of just a button to purchase all the different items in your cart. So let's go and check out what this looks like. So I'm going to add some sunglasses and a camera. And okay, we don't quite see anything quite yet in items in your cart. Let's go check this out. My bad. It's actually because we don't have access to the title here because this is the product that is inside of our cart. So we're going to go to the ID instead. So we can look at that. So although it's simple, we can see that in our shopping cart modal, we know that we have an ID of 2 and an ID of 3 in our cart. And so to kind of make the logic more simple, we can make a component to show the different cart products inside of our cart specifically. So I'm going to go over to components and I'm going to make a CartProduct.js. We can start by defining this as a functional component called CartProduct. And it's going to take in some props because we're going to get that ID and that quantity in order to make a nice looking component from that data. And so we can export default cart product just to get that out of the way. I'm going to import button from React Bootstrap, and you can import components specifically by doing this /button syntax. I'm also going to import the cart context because I want to get access to the delete function inside of our cart context. So I can say from .. cart context. Then we're also going to need that import use context from React. Then I'm also going to import that very important function get product data so we can take those IDs and get the title and the price from them. Amazing. So that's everything we need to get started. So let's get started by saying const cart is equal to use context of the cart context just to set that up. And so I'm going to pass in the ID and the quantity as props. And so the ID is going to be equal to the props.id and the quantity is going to be equal to the props.quantity. Using these props, I can also do things like get the product data of a certain ID. So we can say get product data of the ID that we have at line 8, for example. So now at the end, we can return. I'm going to make this a little React fragment so we have everything to live inside here. I'm going to make an h3 to hold the title of the product. So I'm going to say h3 product data.title. Going to make a paragraph here, and I'm going to say quantity total. So, 3 total products, for example, is what that would be showing us. I can make another paragraph to show the total price of all these things. So I'm going to make a $sign there. Then I'm going to say quantity. So how many products do we have? And then I'm going to get that price by going to product data dot price. I'm also going to use that dot to fixed of 2 just to make sure we don't have any crazy long trailing decimals. Then I'm going to give the user a button, which I'm going to say is of size small, and it's going to allow the user to remove a product from their cart while they're within the cart. And so when we click on this button, we want to have the on click be ran, and we want to point it to a cart.delete from cart, and we can take the current ID that this cart product component was created with. Then I'm going to have an HR at the bottom here, and this is just going to be a little like line break to show a little style between different products. So if we go over to our navbar here, we can actually show our cart product instead of this H1 here. So let's go to the top and import cart product from ./CartProduct. Instead of showing this element here, we can instead make a cart product like this. And we are going to expect 2 different parameters. First one is we're going to set the ID equal to ID. And the second one is we're going to set the quantity equal to quantity. Also going to set the key here equal to the index. Oh, my bad. And these should be current product dot ID and then the current product dot quantity. There we go. And so now we're making cart products for every single thing in our cart. So let's go over to our front end. So let's add everything to the cart just to test it. And amazing. So we have 1 coffee, which is going to be $4.99 total. And then look, we have sunglasses. It shows we have 3 total, and it even adds up that total price to sunglasses times 3. And we have 1 camera. Let's try to remove these sunglasses, for example, because that's 3 different totals. So we can remove like that. And now that's going to be gone from our cart. The cool thing is, even though we're in the modal, look at our navbar. It's still updated to show that we have 2 items in our cart. So we have fully completed the React portion of this, which is super great news. This means we can get into adding the Stripe API on top of this project. When you press this purchase items button right here, we're going to make a Stripe API call to make a checkout with an actual Stripe account. So let's get started by setting up our Stripe account. So go on over to stripe.com and we can start by creating an account. Press sign in on the top right and then create a Stripe account or sign in with one you already have. So Stripe actually makes this as easy as possible for you. As soon as you sign up, you're going to see this for developers on the right here. You're going to want to reveal your secret key. Copy this secret key and save it somewhere else. So let's just do that now. On the bottom here, I'm going to split my terminal. You can also just open a new terminal. And you're going to want to make sure you're not in your store folder anymore. And I'm going to just make a server.js. And so we actually need a backend server to handle these Stripe calls. So we're going to make a very simple Express server. But for now, just copy paste your secret key inside here so we can use it later. And let's go back to Stripe. So now we can get started on creating products in our Stripe account. We can go to the products tab here, and then we can add our first test product and press add a product here. First, I'm going to add a product called coffee, and I'm going to make it worth $4.99. And I want to make it a one-time payment. And we can save the product by going up here. So when we create products, it's going to give us a price ID, which references that product. So make sure to copy this ID and then bring it over to your text file and just say something like coffee is equal to that certain ID. We can then press back here to go to products and make another product. I'm going to call this sunglasses and sell it for $9.99. Make it a one-time payment, save that product. And again, this price ID is super important. Copy it here and bring it over to your text file. Then finally, we can go back to products and make another product. And we're going to make that camera, which we're going to sell for $39.99 and make it a one-time payment. And make sure to copy this API ID here, bring it over your text file. Okay, so I know that was kind of tedious, but that stuff's pretty necessary for setting up Stripe. But now we have everything we need. We have the secret key and also the 3 price API keys for our products. So now we can get started by creating a full backend that's going to handle our Stripe requests. I'm going to say npm init -- yes, and make sure you are on the most outside folder. You're not inside your React folder, because this is going to be a package specifically for our server.js to use a bunch of different npm packages. So you should have a server.js and then also a package.json with nothing in it right now. I'm going to npm install a couple of things. Firstly, I'm going to npm install express to make an Express server. Then I'm going to npm install cores, and I'm also going to install Stripe. This is all we need to make our pretty basic backend. Let's get started by creating the require statements that are necessary for our backend. First, we're going to need express, which we can say const express is equal to require express. Then we're going to need cores. I'm going to say var cores is equal to require cores. Cores is just going to allow any IP address to access our Express server. This is so you guys don't run into any weird errors on the React side of things. And I'm also going to initialize Stripe by saying const Stripe is equal to require Stripe. And Stripe requires an extra parameter, which is going to be parentheses and then an empty string. And within that empty string, it's going to require you to get that secret key that we have above. So copy this full secret key and make sure you get all the characters in there and then save that. This is initializing a Stripe client specifically for our account. We can then create our Express server by saying const app is equal to express. We can have our app use middlewares such as cores. I'm also going to app.use express.static public. This is just something that is recommended by the Stripe documentation specifically, is it wants our Express application to use this. Then we can also use app.use express.json. So our Express application is pretty simple. It's just going to have one post. So we can initialize a post request to our Express server by saying app.post, and we can tell it what path to the server. I'm going to say /checkout is going to be our path. I'm then going to make the functionality asynchronous within here, and we're going to get the request and the response from the user. I'm going to make a comment here explaining what's going to happen is on the React side of things, we are going to pass in some data to the actual request. So it's going to have a request.body.items, which is going to look something like this. It's going to be an array, and it's going to have the ID, then also the quantity. How many of a certain ID do we need, for example? And that's what the .items is going to look like. Stripe uses a thing called line_items. So Stripe wants data formatted in this way. It wants an array still, but instead of an ID, it wants it to say price. Is this kind of annoying? Yes, but it's okay. If we know that our data from our front end is going to look like this, we can just kind of make a new variable to hold what Stripe wants. So I'm going to make a line items equal to an empty array, because that's what Stripe calls items, is line items for their API call. And so I'm going to go and set a constant variable actually equal to the items we're getting from rec.body.items. If we send this items through the body here, we can get access to it like this. And so we can say items.forEach. So for each item, we are going to take a look at the item in there. And then we are going to add two line items and say .push, an object that is formatted in the way that Stripe wants for us to process payments. So we can push an object such as price is equal to our item.id, and then the quantity is going to be equal to our item.quantity. And so line items is going to be our properly formatted data that we are going to send over to Stripe. So we can initialize our session with Stripe by saying const session is equal to await, because we're going to make a Stripe call here that requires await. So we can say stripe.checkout, and this is using the actual Stripe object to use this Stripe object that we imported, and it's going to have a .sessions, and it gives us access to a .create checkout session. When we create a checkout session, we need a couple of properties. First of all, we need a line_items, which is going to be formatted like this. Guess what? We already made that right here. So it's actually going to be really simple for us, as we already formatted the data how they want it. We can set the mode of the checkout. For example, payment is what we're going to be doing. Then we also want the checkout to point to certain links if the checkout is successful or if the checkout is canceled. So the success underscore URL is going to be equal to HTTP localhost 3000/success. The cancel underscore URL is going to be equal to HTTP//localhost 3000/cancel. And because we're using await here, our server is going to wait for Stripe to fully create our checkout session. So once our code gets to line 50, let's say around here, for example, we now have access to a URL which the user can use to check out. We can send to our response some JSON.stringify data. This is just going to allow us to send an object to the front end, and it's going to be an object with one property set to session.url. This allows us to show the user the session that Stripe created for them. So that's how Stripe gets involved. And so to actually start up our Express server to listen, we can say app.listen to port 4000 is where we're going to have the server live on. And then we're going to just do a little callback function here. We can say console.log listening on port 4000. Just to show the backend working, I'm also going to console.log this request.body so we can see that in the terminal. But Stripe kind of makes it simple for us. Just to explain this backend again, we're going to send a post request to the /checkout route. It's going to take the posted data from the user here. It's going to format the line items to how Stripe wants them. It's then going to create a session with those line items, and it's going to make a payment session. And then once this session gets fully created, it's going to send that created session URL to the front end so our user can pretty much check out with Stripe. So let's go to the right terminal here and say npm start, which is pretty much starting up our server. On the left, I still have our React application running. So hopefully you still have these 3 different IDs at the top here. I want you guys to copy these 3 different IDs, go over to your React application, and then go into your product store.js. Here's where things get interesting, is we can make the coffee ID actually equal to that price ID, and we can do the same thing for all the other products. This is so we don't even have to add some additional functionality. We can just make the IDs, an actual ID instead of like a 1, 2, or 3. We can just use these price IDs that we have created on the Stripe side of things. This way, whenever we interact with a product, we know the actual exact price ID that is on the Stripe side of things. All right, we are so close to getting to the final version of this project. Now we want to go to where our checkout button is living. So for example, over in the Navbar, and we want to create a request to our backend when you click purchase items. So we can set purchase items equal to onClick is equal to checkout, and we can make a function called checkout. So I'm going to say const checkout is equal to a asynchronous function. I'm going to use some arrow syntax here where we say async, the parameters to the function, which I don't need any, and then we're going to define the function logic with an arrow like this. Then I'm going to make an await statement because we are now going to make a fetch request to our backend, which I hosted at http://localhost4000/checkout. And if you guys remember from the Express side of things, we want to make sure that we are posting. So we have to say method is equal to post to our backend. The headers, this is also important, are going to be of content type application/JSON. This allows us to send some JSON.stringify code in the body. So take a look at this. We can set the body of the request equal to JSON.stringify. Then I can say, okay, stringify an object where the items property is equal to cart.items. And we have access to cart.items because we already have this context defined right here. There you go. A great example of good use of context. So once this fetch statement is fully done, we can handle the response that we get back from our server by saying .then, take that response, and we are going to need to kind of translate that response, which is kind of common, and return a response.json. This turns the response into a JSON format that is easy for our code to interpret. So we can say .then, response again. And now that we have access to the response, take a look at the server.js again. We are getting an object that has a URL. So if we decoded this and we're getting the JSON of this, if we say response.url, it's going to give us access to this session.url here. So if response.url exists, just to, kind of safeguard us, we can then say window.location.assign. And so this is going to kind of overwrite whatever the user is currently looking at and show them that response.url. So it's going to forward them over to the Stripe payment. So just to explain what's happening again, when we click purchase items here, it's going to go and check out for us. Once we hit checkout, we are going to make a post to the checkout route to our backend of localhost 4000. We're going to make it of content type application JSON, and we're going to pass the items from our cart to our backend. Over on our backend, we are then going to take those items, make them into a format that Stripe understands, and then create a session with those line items. Once the session is fully created with Stripe, we are then going to send the URL back to our front end, get that response from our backend turned into a JSON, and then get the URL out of that JSON and forward the user over to Stripe. So I'll just put that here, forwarding user to Stripe. And so if you are on a fresh account, you're going to want to make sure that you go to dashboard.stripe.com/account. This is because Stripe requires you to make a company name even if you're just doing test payments. So I'm going to make my name Cooper Codes. I'm going to save here. So once you have a company name, you are good to go. So let's go to our localhost and see how this works. We can go over to our React application now and add in a bunch of items to our cart. Add in a bunch of coffee, a bunch of sunglasses, and I'm just going to add one camera. Now we can go over to the cart, see all of our different items here, and then purchase the items by pressing this button on the bottom. And so this is where everything comes full circle. We have fully initialized a payment. We have 3 coffees in here, which even Stripe recognized, 7 different sunglasses. It's kind of expensive, and also a camera here as well. And so we can put in some fake information that Stripe gives us. The test Visa card is just 424242 over and over. Then you can put in 1234 for the date, and then also 123 for the security code. I'm going to make the name on the card Cooper Codes, but this can be anything again. Going to make 12345 my zip code. And now we can make a full Stripe payment. Amazing. So Stripe went and sent us over to the success route. So let's go take a look at our Stripe dashboard and see if the payment went through. So from our home, we can already see that payment here, but we can go over to payments over here, and you can see the fully successful payment. It also shows Stripe's cut and everything like that. And so this is the full kind of circle of showing you guys a payment processing system with Stripe and also managing a bunch of different items on React. If you made it this far in the video, I just want to say thanks so much for kind of coming through the full project with me and working through the full thing. Again, I'm super excited to have been able to show you guys this full project and work with Brad. So thank you so much, Brad, again. Hopefully this content was helpful, and honestly, if I had a project like this earlier on, especially when I was learning React, there's a bunch of good stuff for you guys to learn throughout this project that really makes you think in, think in components, think in, how can I use context in different areas of my application. And so hopefully this video was super helpful. All right, thank you so much for watching.